Thank you for gathering here. As always, it's a delight to have a good audience when these wonderful speakers come and regale us with their presentations, storytelling, and history. We have two wonderful speakers today, Anirudh Kanisetti and Kamini Dandapani. And I'd like to introduce Anirudh first. Anirudh is the award-winning author of Lords of the Deccan. And is there a counter with the books here? Yeah. Oh, wonderful. Sister Anila Verghese. So I'll introduce you. It's a book which, personally I also found filled a big, gap in my understanding of history. I grew up in Delhi, and when you study in Delhi, what you essentially read is the history of North India, the history of the Islamic and Mughal periods, and the colonial history. And the entire Deccan, for the most part, is a black hole. Occasionally you get peripheral mentions of people like the Vijayanagara rulers and all, but there's a whole lot more, as you will discover during the course of the evening today. He received the Tata Literature Live Best Non-Fiction Book of the Year Award in 2022 and was featured in the Week's 40 Under 40 list for India's most promising creatives, as well as opened the magazine Open Minds for 2022 Soft Power list. Anirudh's research has received grants from the Princeton Center for Digital Humanities and the India Foundation for the Arts. His writings and work have been featured in The Hindu, The New Indian Express, and Live Mint, among others. He writes the popular Thinking Medieval column for The Print. Anirudh was formerly editor of the Museum of Art and Photography and associate fellow at the Takshashila Institution. He hosts two popular and critically acclaimed podcasts, Echoes of India and Yuddha. So, may I welcome you.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you to the entire team at Sarmaya. Thank you all for being here on this lovely evening in Bombay. I'd like to talk today about the Deccan. And as I call it, it's medieval India's great forgotten superpower. Over the course of the nearly 500 years that my book covers, most of the sources that I've looked at, from inscriptions to travelers' accounts, are very emphatic that the Deccan was considered to be the foremost among India's kingdoms. And yet, as Paul just said, it's very much a black hole to all of us. And this is especially striking to me because I'm actually from the Deccan. I grew up in Hyderabad. I worked in Bangalore for the longest time. And back in 2016, when I just got my first job, and I walked into the beautiful Blossom bookstore on Church Street. I don't know if any of you have been there, but I walk in and I ask, do you have a book on Karnataka? Because I want to learn about Karnataka's history. Right? Everybody wants to learn about the places where they're living. And they didn't have anything. They didn't have anything in English. So it's really quite surreal for me to be here this evening, surrounded by all these portraits of heavily mustachioed gentlemen. So let this young man with a less impressive mustache hopefully take you on a journey into the medieval Deccan. So the first thing I'd like to bring your attention to is this idea that a lot of us have, that medieval, the term medieval is almost a term of denigration, right? We call some of the, when there are things that we don't agree with, something that we think of as backwards, we say that that's something that's medieval, it's barbaric. But really what I think the evidence shows us, especially archaeology, art, which we'll get to in the course of this presentation, is that the medieval period, which in South India at least is roughly from 600 to 1200, and really so in the rest of the world as well, is not a dark age, but really a bright age. You can see that from all these samples of art that I've actually collected here. So there's this beautiful mosaic produced in the Byzantine Empire. So that's this part of the world. These are a bunch of dancers from China in the Tang period, so this side of the world. These, of course, are court dancers from the Abbasid court, so this part of the world. So really, what you see over the course of these 500-600 years is that every part of the world begins to see this process of urbanization beginning to happen, the emergence of these luxury-loving, very sophisticated, culturally sophisticated elites who are interested in international trade. So what this leads to is both a deepening in economic networks and a widening in their scope. And we will see just how wide in a few slides. But the important thing to, and of course the subject of my current presentation is really what was going on in India at the time, because when I say medieval, leave aside its connotations of barbarism and so on. I'm sure all of us think of medieval Europe, right? All of us think of the knight in shining armor on the horse and the tournament and the castles and so on. But what I've really enjoyed about the process of writing my book is that now when you say medieval, I do think of knights, but not knights on horses, but knights on elephants, with glistening spears and trumpets and flags and so on. So when I say, I'd first like to ask the question, so when I say superpower, really, what do I mean? To help you understand that, let's try to understand, first of all, what power means in the medieval Indian context. So I'm going to go through sculpture, architecture, and literature, and show how in all of these fields, the Deccan was really one of the great global centers of gravity. This is just a rather poorly drawn map I've made of what medieval India was like. As you can see, it's very different from what we think of as India. It's got these very distinct kind of cultural units. If you look at the archaeology, you'll also see that they have very, very distinct kind of material cultures. But what is also very interesting is that over the course of 600 to 1200, they all begin to participate in this grand kind of overarching cosmopolis, what's called a Sanskrit cosmopolis. So just as any of us can go anywhere in the world and expect to speak English and probably be understood, and the Deccan, as you can see, is really the predominant part of it. So where is the Deccan when we think about the medieval period? So the first thing I'd like to discuss is the question of how sculpture really expresses power. Now, all of us are familiar, and if you've been to the CSMVS, you would have seen these magnificent sculptures that were produced throughout medieval India. But why were they being produced? I think as amazing as it is to have a museum that brings these artifacts to you, one thing that museums do is they remove objects from their original context. And once you actually look at them as they were intended by their creators, you begin to see these very interesting new meanings. So let's look at these two sculptures of the great boar incarnation of Vishnu, Varaha. And you can see that this one was made in Madhya Pradesh in the 5th century. This was produced in the Deccan in the 6th century, so barely a century apart. And you can see very clearly that there's some kind of similarity. So if you look at the composition of this piece, it's got this leg that's thrust out to the side. It's placed on a naga in both cases. The body of the god is lifted up towards the skies. There's all these gods behind them looking on the scene in awe. And of course, there is the goddess Earth, who is looking quite adoringly at Varaha. So this sculpture, we know from its original historical context, was commissioned by the Gupta Emperor Chandragupta II, somebody that we're all familiar with from our school textbooks. And Chandragupta II commissioned this to commemorate his victory over his enemies, the Shaka or Indo-Scythian kings based in Gujarat. Now, what he was trying to do also through this piece, if you look at the inscription that accompanies it, he says that he defeated a coalition of kings in central India with names like Ganapati Naga, Vishnu Naga, Surya Naga. So basically a confederation of Naga peoples, and very clearly what the god is doing, because keep in mind, all of us have heard the legend of Varaha, right? Who does he defeat? He does not defeat a Naga, he defeats a demon. And yet here you have a Naga being depicted and an inscription saying it was made by Samudragupta after defeating a Naga. So very clearly, this seems to be a kind of political allegory where Samudragupta is depicting himself almost as analogous to the god Varaha, rescuing the earth from the Naga rulers. And to me, it is so interesting because the Deccan, just a century later, you have this new kingdom that's rising up, the Chalukya kingdom. Once again, they come from practically from nowhere. They're probably peasants, chiefs who rise up, who establish their control over a bit of territory, and then want to depict themselves and their power in a language, in a vocabulary that's understandable across India. And that language, of course, is the language of sculpture and the language of alluding to the king as a god. So very clearly, that's exactly what is happening here. And the reason why we know that this is the case is not just because I said so, but because of the inscriptions of the Chalukyas, which begin with this magnificent verse, "Victorious is Vishnu made manifest as the boar, shaking the ocean as he comes into view, with the earth resting at peace on the tip of his upraised right tusk." I just want you to imagine what a splendid picture that is. It's even more evocative in the original Sanskrit. So you can really imagine the Chalukyas are depicting themselves almost as Vishnu coming to the earth. And they even take an imperial title that suggests this. They call themselves Sri Prithvi Vallabha, which means fortune's favorite and earth's beloved. And as you can see very clearly here, what else is Varaha except earth's beloved? Therefore, what you're seeing in a very roundabout way is really a portrait of a Deccan emperor made in stone. The contrast in the presentation isn't perfect, so you must forgive me. This is going to happen through the presentation, but hopefully you'll be able to see. So this is not a Deccan sculpture; it is a sculpture from Mamallapuram, built by the Pallava kings who were rivals of the Chalukyas. And once again, you see there's really sophisticated kind of visual allegory that's going on here. And I find that very interesting. So let me first explain the allegory to you, and we'll come to why it's interesting to me. You can see the central focus of this composition is the god Shiva here, who is granting a boon to some kind of starving ascetic. And there's this great channel that's carved into the rock with all these nagas. Originally, there would have been water flowing down this. So one way, and probably the most popular interpretation of what this is meant to represent, is the penance of Bhagirath, who is being granted a boon by Shiva to bring the Ganga down to the earth. But once again, knowing what we know from what the Chalukyas were doing, it's very possible that this is meant to be a reference to the Pallava king himself as being especially favored by Shiva, and who is thus granting him control over the waters. And this is something that we know the Pallavas probably believed because a lot of inscriptions from Tamil Nadu at the time showing that they built all these irrigation systems. So they're very clearly doing these things to build their tax base and so on, but also legitimizing themselves by comparing themselves to gods and sages. But there's another possible interpretation as to what's going on here. There's this very interesting fat little figure. I don't know if you noticed, but he's got this little lion's face, the Kirti Mukha on his tummy. So this is probably meant to represent the Pashupada weapon that the god Shiva grants to Arjuna, the hero of the Mahabharata. So there's something else that this might be referring to. So you already got two meanings. Then once you look at the Nagas, you get another possible meaning, because the Pallavas claim to be descended from Drona, the teacher of the Pandavas. And Drona's son supposedly is, I think I might be mixing up my Mahabharata heroes, but one of those great heroes is supposed to have had a child with a Naga princess who becomes the ancestor of the Pallavas. So there's three potential meanings here. But what is really interesting is if you look at the poetry of this period, a lot of Sanskrit and also the Tamil poetry, there's these very sophisticated visual allegories, these metaphors and similes that are always drawn to give you a sense of what is going on. So what you're seeing is something similar to a Sanskrit or Tamil verse, where it's making these extremely complex and very tricky kind of things. You need to know your mythology, you need to know your literature, you need to know your art to be able to get to the real meaning of what is being hinted at here. And that's kind of how the people of this world appreciate their literature. And when I understood this, it just kind of blew my mind, because when we think of people in the past, there's a tendency to think of them as being more barbaric, simpler, either they're these great heroes or these great villains. But what this shows us is that people who like puzzles, the people who like these tricky little things they like to tinker away at with their brains and trying to figure out what it means. And when they figure out what it means, it brings them joy. That is something that really blows my mind, because it shows that these are people who are just as complicated as you and I. They're not the simplistic figures that we generally make them out to be. The next thing I'd like to talk about is really about architecture as power. So one of the most visible remnants of medieval India, of course, is the medieval temple. Now, once again, with apologies for the contrast on this image, let me try to explain to you roughly how to look at a medieval temple. Now, this temple, fantastic, looks really intimidating, really very tall, very beautiful. That's what all the tour guides will tell you. But once you really try to break down its architecture into modular components, so if you look at this temple here, you can see it's actually made up of three simple components. So on its corners, I don't know how visible this is, but you can see there's a little kind of dome here, and this tall kind of column that it's placed on. So it's this thing, right? And then in the middle of the wall, you see there's a kind of oblong shape with once again a kind of pillar form underneath it, which is this thing. Now, if you look at every single tier of this temple, you'll see the same kind of little dome thing. Once again, the oblong shape, once again, the dome thing. So on every tier, you have the same pattern repeated again and again, which gives you the sense of rhythm, of this kind of moving complexity, as though the weight of the superstructure is cascading down tier by tier. And once you actually look at this magnificent structure, the Virupaksha, the Lokeshwara temple at Pattadakal today, you'll see that's exactly how it's designed, where it has these dome-shaped, oblong, dome-shaped, once again, dome-shaped, oblong, dome-shaped. So this great dome that's on top of the superstructure seems to be replicated both on the ordinal and the cardinal directions, which gives the building such a profound sense of dynamism. So once again, you can see that these are not people who are necessarily doing things just because they're superstitious. They're making temples that are beautiful. They think that they are beautiful things to be making and to be bringing into the world. What is especially interesting to me about the Lokeshwara temple is how, once again going back to sculptures as par, a lot of the iconography is actually replete with political messaging. Now, once again, when you go to the tourist guides, once you actually go around these temples, they'll tell you, okay, so here's Shiva in this form, here's Vishnu in that form. But why were those particular forms chosen? The sculpture that we looked at a little earlier of Shiva granting this boon to whoever this figure is, possibly analog for the Pallava king, you can see that Chalukyas, the Deccan emperors who built the Virupaksha Lokeshwara temple, have taken the exact same sculpture. They've copied it and they've put it on their temple. The reason for this is because the Chalukyas actually attacked the Pallavas in the 7th century. You can see that there's these 3 little figures here, not too clear, but you can see that there's a little arm here, there's a trunk, but there's no head. Right? So there's 3 figures, 1, 2, 3 that are beheaded. So these are all meant to be stand-ins, analogs of various Pallava kings. And when the Chalukyas attacked the Pallavas, and Mahamalapuram was their capital, they went in and they beheaded these 3 representatives of Pallava kings because these guys were their rivals. They had humiliated the Chalukyas before, so the Chalukyas now have to go and put them in their place. And once they do that, they take the essential meaning of what this entire sculpture represents, which is that the Pallava king is divinely favored by Shiva, and they take this central image and they put it in their own temple, as though Shiva's favor has been transferred to them through war. So you can see that they understood what the Pallavas are trying to say. So these minds are also as sharp, as attuned to literature and puzzles as the Pallavas are. They understand, but they are also militarily dominant. And it's also very interesting because the Pallavas make all these comparisons to themselves as Shiva. Can anybody guess what this is meant to represent? Yes. It is very strange for Ravana to be given such an important position and composition. Like he takes up 2/3 of the entire composition. Shiva's entire mountain, Kailash, has been shaken by this very well-carved, very swarthy, bulky-looking Ravana. Very obviously, and once again, this is from the same temple. So it's very possible, in a very roundabout way, and very surprising to us, that the Chalukyas are comparing themselves to Ravana, shaking the foundations of the Kailasha, that is the Pallava kingdom. Since I have a little bit of time, I'd like to also talk about the individual who commissioned the Lokeshwara temple, which was not a Chalukya king, but rather a Chalukya queen. This remarkable character here is Loka Mahadevi, who built, of course, the Lokeshwara temple, the lord of Loka Mahadevi. And the reason why we know this is Loka Mahadevi is because she's holding a royal scepter, which is surmounted with an elephant, once again a symbol of male royalty. And she's standing on a throne with 3 lions, a simhasana. So there's a lion throne that this lady is standing on. What is really interesting to me about this sculpture is that it is positioned in a very prominent place on the temple's Nandi Mandapa, which is the hall where the Nandi bull is kept. And on one of the corners of the temple is this other woman who looks rather lonely, right? This figure who's holding onto a branch, looking off into the distance, and has a little boy standing next to her. This is probably meant to represent Loka Mahadevi's sister, Trilokya Mahadevi. And it's very interesting where it's positioned, because Trilokya Mahadevi was originally the senior wife of the Chalukya king Vikramaditya, who Loka Mahadevi was also married to. Trilokya Mahadevi had a son, so even though she was the younger sister, she was a senior wife because she had a son. And because she was a senior wife, she had these resources at her disposal and tried to build a temple. But she died before it was completed, which made her elder sister, Loka Mahadevi, finally the chief queen. So when Loka Mahadevi builds her temple, she makes a little sculpture of her sister and positions it on her completed temple to look at the temple that her sister never managed to live to see completed. So Is this a sign of sibling rivalry? Is it a sign of personality? It's difficult to say. We don't have a label saying it's Tralokya Mahadevi, but I'd like to believe it is. Once again, just showing you that these people have personalities, even though so little of them survives, given that they're so far away from us. Now, the next thing I'd like to talk about. So, very often we think of temples, as I said, as sacred sites. And now, hopefully, we also think of them as architectural and political sites. But one thing that's very important for us to not forget is that temples are also ritual sites. Now, as somebody who's grown up with a very, very pious and devout mother, I'm not very pious and devout, as you can imagine. But the reason and that's why I really find these temples so interesting, is because it shows me that when they were building temples, they genuinely believed that temples were engines that could shape the fabric of reality. The way that a temple modulates space and light. So if you look at this magnificent shrine here, which is at the Shavatara cave in Ellora, there's this very clear modulation of space through the regular placement of these pillars. And you can see that they do understand that light is going to come in from this side. It's going to be much darker deep inside the cave. It's going to be much lighter here. I don't have all the other pillars, but you can see there's sculptures on every bit of the wall. So as you step in and you look down different corridors, different aisles of pillars, it's like you see a different sculpture of God and a different representation of it. So it's almost as if you're seeing this refraction of different aspects of the deities that the kings are comparing themselves to. And in this magnificent shrine, the Kailashnatha Temple at Ellora, arguably the greatest architectural achievement of the medieval Deccan, once again you have this very clear understanding of space, because actually let me show you. Yes, now this temple, if you remember the design of the Lokeshwara temple you were looking at a little earlier, it's kind of similar, right? So it has the same kind of projection out in the center, the same modulation, the same kind of rhythmic interspersal, these dome-shaped and oblong elements, but it's twice the size of Lokeshwara, so it's enormous. So the Lokeshwara is probably around this big compared to how big this is. Now, this was excavated straight into the rock, as you can see. So it's an absolutely enormous monolith excavated directly into a cliffside. Now, it was very obvious that the people who built this, the Rashtrakuta dynasty who defeated the Chalukyas, wanted to represent themselves as better than the Chalukyas. And obviously the best way to do that is to build a temple that's twice as big as a Chalukya temple. So these guys are twice as good as the Chalukyas. But if they had simply taken the Lokeshwara temple and made it double the size, then we can imagine it would have been something like this, right? It would have been just the bottom of the rock here, and the temple would have been this big. But it would also have been very dark. Not a lot of light would have managed to reach all the way to the bottom of the temple, which would not have made it as ritually efficacious. So what they do is they add a whole lower story, this enormous plinth, which you don't see in any other Deccan temple of the period, to elevate the actual ritual space up into the light. It's absolutely brilliant. And because really think about the engineering that had to go into making something like this. And to actually give you a sense of that, I have an animation which I'd like to show you all. So here's the top of the rock, and this is probably how they excavated. So straight down, using the natural slope of the rock to remove the debris, going layer by layer, excavating it, and then as they finish the first story, they start excavating a ramp behind the temple, and then gradually finish excavating the lower story. And then all that's left is this final wall, and then they remove it. And there you have the finished temple. Now, what the epigraphic evidence suggests is that they did this entire thing about 10 to 12 years. So I'd like you to imagine the hundreds of sculptors you would need to keep employed this entire time, the hundreds of blacksmiths you would need to keep their chisels sharp, the number of cooks you would need, the number of people you need just to keep removing and ferrying away the debris. And I'd like to ask you, does this seem like the creations of somebody who's living in a dark age? This was probably the largest freestanding structure on Earth when it was completed. And the logistical challenge of creating something is the engineering knowledge it requires. And of course, the sheer amount of wealth it would have taken, much of which was obtained through war, which we'll come to, shows you that these are people who see themselves as the great global superpower. there is no sense in a temple of this scale, of this size, that they see themselves as the world's backwater, or that they see themselves in their times as being somewhat backward. They are using every limit of technology available to them to create extraordinary this is not just architecture, it's a sculpture that is so large that it is architecture. I'd like to just let that sink in. And once again, let's try to ask ourselves, why is it that the medieval Deccan is not considered a superpower? Why is it forgotten? The third aspect I'd like to talk about the medieval Deccan is its literature. So we were talking a little earlier about how Sanskrit had become the great language of the Indian subcontinent, also beyond. It had spread into Southeast Asia. So people who went from Kashmir all the way to Southeast Asia could speak Sanskrit and expect to be understood by elites. But something interesting happens in the Deccan in the 9th century when a Deccan emperor called Amoghavasha realizes that he's probably had enough of performing for the larger Sanskrit-speaking world, and now he wants to speak to local lords. He wants to integrate them deeper into his imperial network. And so what he does is he takes a Sanskrit poetic manual and he adapts it to create literature in Kannada. Now, of course, Kannadigas were already singing, speaking in their language for many centuries before that. But Amoghavasha says something really quite rude. So this is from his great text, The Way of the King of the Poets, or the Kavi Rajamargam. And what he says is, it is difficult to create poetry in Kannada. With the native language having so many variations, even Vasuki, the thousand-headed king of serpents, the paragon of scholarship, would become frustrated, unable to identify and fix the faults in the usage of Kannada dialects. Now, that's not a very nice thing to say about your mother tongue, ostensibly, but it's very interesting because what he then does after identifying all these faults in how Kannada is spoken and all these sounds that apparently don't agree with his refined Sanskrit-speaking ears, is he gives this great manual where he studies Sanskrit and Prakrit grammars and he uses them to create this new courtly register of Kannada, which according to him contains all the great ingredients of what makes literature, and it becomes an absolute cultural phenomenon. From the 8th century, I think about 60 to 70%, if not more, of the inscriptions that are being produced in the Deccan were being made in Sanskrit. By 900 or the year 1000, it was barely 10 to 20%. Everything had shifted to Kannada, because Kannada was now the language that everybody could participate in. All the local lords of Amoghavasha's network could now create and speak in courtly Kannada and expected to be celebrated for it. Now, so there's this whole wave of Kannada poetry that's unleashed, and what is really interesting is that this movement begins to be picked up in other parts of the world as well. So in the 10th century, you see that Telugu also begins to create this very Sanskritized courtly register. Tamil, of course, did have a courtly version of it, but by the 10th century, it begins to become more Sanskritized. What is really interesting to me is that this doesn't really happen in North India. So in North India, the kings continue to speak Sanskrit, and this very interesting 11th century king called Bhoja of Dhara, again, a brilliant encyclopedic mind who writes a great Sanskrit grammar. And he refused to even acknowledge that the emerging upper Brahmshas, the medieval dialects that would later evolve into Khari Boli and then into Hindi, he thinks they aren't even languages. According to him, only Sanskrit is a language that is worthy to be spoken. So you can really see that the Deccan is a global leader when it comes to vernacularization. And this is a trend that will also be picked up all the way in Southeast Asia. So very clearly, there's something politically brilliant that Amoghavasha kind of unleashes that then becomes picked up in other parts of the world. One thing that I did mention a little earlier was about how the Kailashnatha Temple was built. I said it was built through war because, of course it was. You're not going to be able to sell enough rice in 10 lifetimes to be able to build a temple like that. What was really happening, the reason why the medieval Deccan was a great superpower was because, and I apologize that you can't really see it in this map, was because the Deccan empires commanded the Godavari Krishna Valley. Now, that is the third largest river valley in the entirety of South Asia. The only river valleys larger than that are the Indus River Valley and the Gangetic Plains. None of these river valleys in the medieval period had a single empire controlling them. And there's a reason why on the few occasions the Gangetic Plains are actually united, they end up going and invading everybody else. But you can see that's actually what happens in the medieval period, is because the other river valleys don't have a great imperial formation controlling them, that it's really the heyday of the Godavari Krishna. So by controlling the Godavari Krishna valley, the Rashtrakutas have the manpower needed to go on these great plundering expeditions all the way to North India, all the way to Kannauj, in fact, and also deep into the Gangetic Plains. And it's through going on these plundering expeditions that they seize the material wealth, the jewels, the gold, the stuff that's easy for you to pick up and bring back to your capital. And that's what funnels this great expansion, this wave of temple building. And I'm hoping that when Kamini gives her talk, she will tell us about the Chola expeditions to North India. Now, once again, I'm sure all of us have heard of the Cholas. If you haven't heard of the Cholas, then you haven't heard of Ponniyin Selvan, and I don't know how you would not have heard of that, given what an absolute cultural phenomenon it's become. But everybody's heard of the Cholas going to North India and attacking the Ganga and doing all these things. But to me, it's very obvious that because less than a century before the Cholas emerge onto the scene, the Rashtrakuta emperors of Deccan are doing the exact same thing. They're very clearly going north, south, east, west. They're conquering the directions. They're doing what in classical Indian texts is called a Digvijaya. They're conquering the directions, bringing wealth and tribute from all the dimensions, all the parts of their world, and centering it in their capitals, thus establishing themselves, their temples, their capitals, as a center of this kind of political universe around which the entire subcontinent revolves. Once again, once you actually read the contemporary sources, it becomes very clear that's how they saw this, but given that we know so little about the medieval Deccan, it's very easy to forget how influential it really was. I'd like to begin this slide actually with a question. Can anybody guess where this Buddha was produced and where it was discovered? Kashmir. Who was the gentleman? Brilliant, sir. Where was it discovered?
The Deccan?
No, not the Deccan. No guesses? Not China? Okay. You're getting closer. No. Sweden. Yes. It was discovered in a hoard of Viking artifacts that were buried near Stockholm in probably the 7th or 8th century. So it was produced in Kashmir in the 5th or 6th century and then was gradually traded across the entire world over the course of about 100 years. So there are clearly these relays of trade where goods are gradually moving across the entirety of Eurasia, because you have all these courts that are very interested in these refined material cultural objects that come from the farthest reaches of the world. So you have these courts in Iraq, you have these courts in Turkey, you have these courts in Greece, you have these courts along the Volga River, and that's how gradually these objects are traded again and again. This beautiful coin that you see here is actually a coin of the Rashtrakuta Emperor Govinda III, who ruled at the beginning of the 9th century. And to me, it's very interesting because this is obviously in an Indic script, but if you look at these letters, it's all complete gibberish. It's just random letters that don't make any sense. It's just symbols, not even letters. And the reason why they don't make any sense is because they're meant to be imitations of Arabic script. So, this very angular Kufic script that was used by the Umayyad Caliphate was then picked up by the Rashtrakutas who thought it was pretty or something, and then made it and put it on this coin. But of course, as much as they may have thought it was pretty, there were also very clear pragmatic reasons why they did this, because you can see the emperor here is riding on a horse. And horses were probably being imported from Arabia this early in time. And they were trading for them with gold coins, and they obviously wanted the gold coins to look like the coins that were being issued by the caliphate, which shows you really how globalized they were and how widespread their world was. And it's very interesting to me that the inscription here on the back of the coin calls Govinda III Apratihata, invincible. So the implication the coin seems to be making is that through engaging in global trade, through the use of horses, Govinda III is an invincible emperor. And if you think about the scale and the speed at which the Rashtrakutas do their raids, especially to North India, to South India, they do have large numbers of cavalry. So what we're seeing here is part of this enormous political economy of conquest and temple building and so on that you're seeing represented here in this one tiny little object that probably won't even be as big as my thumbprint. These objects here are ceramic plates that were produced in China and discovered in a shipwreck off the coast of Indonesia. There were about 60,000 of these bowls that were discovered. So you can't really see it on the map, unfortunately, but they were being produced here in southern China. They were going through the South China Sea. The boat probably stopped somewhere in Sumatra. Then it tried to turn around the Straits of Sunda to try and catch the monsoon winds directly to India, but that's where it sunk. 60,000 bowls, and they were probably made using some kind of proto-industrial manufacturing. We know that there were probably teams of people who focused on, producing the clay, and then people who put the bowls into the right shape, people who fired it, people who painted on the designs, people who enameled it and then fired it, and then people who were dedicated to packing it. And the ship that carried these objects was probably very multi-ethnic, because you have all these other little objects that were discovered on the ship. And that to me indicates very clearly then, and these, if you look at the designs on the bowls, they have all these beautiful kind of arabesque foliage and geometric designs. So it was probably meant to be exported to West Asia. So if you think of, once again, of the political economy as making this happen, you have buyers in West Asia who are able to transmit designs and finances and so on through a network of intermediaries across India's west coast, across its south coast, through Southeast Asia, all the way to China. And they have business partners there and ship owners there who are working for them, fulfilling these orders and trying to bring them back. And what is fascinating about that shipwreck that I just showed you is that it also had these magnificently worked gold vessels that were probably meant as wedding gifts to a couple that just got married in Java, a royal couple. And there's also these other beautiful little objects. There's a little ink stone that may have been used by a diplomat. And there's also some really sad objects. There was a little ceramic dog that was probably meant as a gift from a sailor to his child. And the child never got to see the gift or his father, which I just find really, really tragic. But the Rashtrakutas are obviously a very big part of this world, because India was the central point of the Indian Ocean. You simply did not have the technology to get ships across the entire Indian Ocean in one go. So by definition, your ships would have to stop in the Indian Ocean. They would come with the monsoon, they would stop, they would come with the southwest monsoon, wait for the northeast monsoon, then continue. And a lot of these merchants really put down roots, and the Rashtrakutas are very well aware of these diasporas and tried to make use of them. So this really interesting inscription, which was produced in the southern part of Gujarat, I think in the early 10th century, refers to an individual called Madhumati, who had conquered the chiefs of the harbors and placed his own officials in them, and who was the son of Sahiarahara, and who made a grant for the repairs of a matha and for the Naivedya of the goddess Durga. Now that's very interesting, because it sounds like, of course, the classical Sanskrit praise of a king, but Madhumati, son of Sahiarahara, is actually a Sanskrit depiction of Muhammad, the son of Shahryar. So what you have here is a Persian individual who has settled down on India's west coast, and who is placed in control of a port by the Rashtrakuta emperor, and who is now Indianized to the point where he's describing himself as an Indian king would, and who's making grants to a temple as an Indian king would. And this is so interesting to me, because it's similar to how we ourselves behave when we are, for example, living in the US. We very often go out of our way to present ourselves as Americans, or if you're living in the UK, we do the same thing. And you can see the reverse process happening here, where this Persian gentleman is trying to present himself as an Indian chief would, because he is, for all intents and purposes, an Indian chief. That is so fascinating. Another really interesting thing about the Rashtrakuta court is that it participated in technological exchanges. So we know from a 10th century Byzantine or Eastern Roman traveler, a Greek traveler, who visited the Abbasid court, that the Abbasids had this huge mechanical fountain in their throne room with a pool of mercury, which, as you can imagine, was probably great for the health. So there's a pool of mercury and these galloping horses and this whole silver tree with golden birds on that would sing. And we know from a 10th century text, the Yashastilaka, that the Rashtrakuta court had this. They didn't have the same kind of thing in their throne room, but they were using mechanical fountains and so on in what's called the Yantradhara Graha. So the house of the mechanical marvels. So this is a bathing hall of sorts. And you can see in this illustration that a friend of mine made, though we kind of messed up with depicting the fountains, that they had supposedly fountains in the shapes of monkeys, in the shapes of snakes and lotuses and beautiful women. And if you press them on different parts of, you press the monkey's tail, for example, water would come out of its mouth. that kind of thing, like scented water. So it's very luxurious kind of courtly culture that's participating not just in trade, but also like actually exchanging technology with networks of knowledge that are stretching deep into Eurasia. If you were to look at the earliest Deccan temple, so we started this presentation, I was talking about, this 6th century cave temple that was made in the Deccan. And then we looked at the Lokeshwara temple in particular made in the 8th century. If you look at this very early temple, earliest structural freestanding stone temples in southern India, you can see that, the design is really simplistic. Now, those little modules we spoke about, right? Those little dome-shaped and oblong ones, you can see they're kind of there, but really not very clearly defined in this early temple in the 7th century. Now look at this magnificent creation from the 11th century. Look how beautifully every single architectural element is delineated tier after tier, just like pulling your eyes almost to the heavens. And you can see in this beautiful illustration by architectural historian Adam Hardy how this process happened, where they moved from these very simple shrines and they try to make them more complex, right? So they're adding these layers and layers to the Vimana, the tier, the superstructure, and that's not enough. So they begin to make the floor plan more complex. So they start to bring it out, layer by layer. So there's more and more surface to decorate. And then it starts to get really out of hand. By this point, we can't really see what's going on. So they say, let's not have the simple square with squares projecting from it. Let's have a square and rotate squares around it, which gives you this beautiful stellate plan, as you can see in this temple. So what we also see is not just the stylistic evolution, but also the number of temples begin to accelerate. As you reach the 11th, 12th century, it's no longer just the royal court, but also these local chiefs, the ministers of kings who are building all this. So very clearly what's happening is that all this wealth that is being collected, both from the bottom up through agricultural systems and also through raids, is now trickling down, it's not just concentrated in the imperial court, but also now sub-courts. All these smaller kings are kind of emulating the imperial model of the Chalukyas and Rashtrakutas, and now they're also building their own temples. So the political economy of the Deccan is becoming more and more complex. So that brings me almost to the end of my presentation. So clearly, these 500 years were pretty damn amazing, and we should really read more about them. But because I don't want you to come away from this presentation thinking that these people were in some way alien to us, I want to end with this beautiful fragment of a letter that was written by an Arab merchant to his wife. So basically, he hasn't been home for nearly 10 years because, as you can imagine, the life of a merchant in a time when you don't have airplanes or, steamships is not a very easy one. You're away from home for years and years at a time, trying to make business connections, trying to set down routes, figure out what to trade and for what prices. So his wife has asked him for a divorce. And she sent him a letter. Clearly, the letter has reached him. So that should give you a sense of how sophisticated these delivery systems are. And he says, now if this is your wish, I cannot blame you, for the waiting has been long. And I do not know whether the Creator will grant relief so I can come home, or whether matters will take time, for I cannot come home with nothing. So he hasn't made enough. He cannot face his family without having made a fortune for himself. Now the matter is in your hand. If you wish separation from me, accept the bill of repudiation and you are free. But if this is not your decision and not your desire, so maybe his father-in-law was not a very nice person, who knows. Do not lose these long years of waiting. Perhaps relief is at hand and you will regret a time when regret will be of no avail. And then he ends by saying, all day long I have a lonely heart and I am pained by our separation. I feel that pain when writing these lines. Just remember this, all these individuals seem so alien to us, who are building these temples, going on these great conquering expeditions, doing all this trade. Just remember that at the end of the day, all the people that people like Kamini and I are writing about are just people like you and me. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much for the wonderful talk, Anirudh. Now we are open for questions.
Yeah, good evening. This last paragraph that you read, the letter, it's in which original language?
So it's written in Arabic, and this is in a paper by Professor Ranabir Chakravarti at Jawaharlal Nehru University. I can share it with you later if you'd like.
That'll be great.
My pleasure.
Thank you for a beautiful presentation.
Thank you, sir.
It was a delight.
Thank you.
I just want to draw your attention to the Kirti Mukha's stomach fellow. He also occurs as Pashupati in Tala.
Oh.
Yes. And it's a visual fusion of many animals, including iguanas, and then he has this grinning yaksha. I have written about this in the speaking tree, but this suggests that it is Pashupata rather than Agatsya.
Okay.
And the second thing is in the Perumal temple, you have actually a frieze of Kiratarjuneya.
Yes.
With a boar in the background, which shows the Pallava lineage. So it is likely to be Arjuna rather than Agatsya.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for this lovely talk.
Thank you.
While we are quite clear that the kings of the Deccan were quite advanced in many respects, how does this compare with other great civilizations, contemporary civilizations of that time, say the Tang dynasty or maybe somebody in Mesopotamia or other parts of the world?
That's a very interesting question because we actually have an Arab gentleman from the 9th century who asked and answered the exact same question. He says, there are 4 great kings in the world. Being an Arab, of course, he has to say the first is the Caliph. And the second is the Eastern Roman Emperor, the Byzantine Emperor at Constantinople. The third is the Emperor of China. And the fourth is an individual he calls the Balhara king. And Balhara is probably an Arabic rendition of Vallabharaja. So the Emperor of the Deccan was considered to be on par with the other. So 4 great kings, one of the great superpowers of the world. It really depends because I don't think there is an objective way of comparing art because it really depends, as they say, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, to use a bit of a cliche. Depends on what you're looking for because I certainly think that if we had more archaeology and were slightly better at preserving our monuments, I think the scale, the density of the art that was being produced in medieval India, and particularly the medieval Deccan, was definitely on a scale comparable to what is going on in the Arab or the Tang worlds. It's just that the Tang had much more of a habit of keeping archival records, which subsequent dynasties maintained. We know that, for example, the sands of Iraq are really great at preserving material culture, but that has really not been the case in the medieval Deccan. There is so much buried under the earth that is still waiting for us to discover once we dig it up. So my suspicion is it's on the same scale, but it's difficult to make an objective comparison, say this is the metric on which we're going to compare it. So, yeah.
Good evening.
Hi.
My question is about late medieval age. What I see that from Samudragupta, from Bindusara to Samudragupta, they all used to capture South India, and rather than annexing it, most of them will end up taking tributaries. I think Khilji was the first one who actually sent somebody. So if Deccan is supposed to be such a rich area, which it is, then why there was a reluctance on the part of North Indian rulers not to annex those areas? That's something that I've been speculating for a long time. So I thought maybe you could shed some light on it.
So I think the very simple answer is in geopolitics, right? Because these are all ancient and medieval empires. They don't have the kind of infrastructure, the kind of communications infrastructure that we have. It is not possible for an emperor based in North India to control South India. Because if you look at, for example, when the Delhi Sultanate does try to do it, when the Tughlaqs established their garrisons and so on, within 50 years, it's over. They cannot maintain control because when there's a rebellion in the Deccan and they come down to stop it, there's a rebellion in the Gangetic Plains, so they had to rush off to do that. And finally, it is just not possible to maintain that control. It's really, I think, very significant that after Aurangzeb, the first ruler of North India, first Indian-born ruler to actually control the Deccan is Jawaharlal Nehru. I don't think it's a coincidence. It's just simple geopolitical logic. I hope that answers your question.
So I actually have 2 questions for you. The first is, for example, if you look at the Ottomans, there is a repurposing of monuments, churches become mosques. Is there a reason why that, one of the reasons perhaps why that did not happen in medieval Deccan could be the wealth and the ability to create new sites. And so would you, one, comment on that? And I think my second question is, why do you think that the history of the Rashtrakutas or some of these stories have actually, why are they not a part of our of the narrative, even in the South, even in the southern states? What is it about our contemporary history that we've actually sort of erased these parts?
That's a really fantastic question. I'm actually going to begin by answering that. I think the simple answer is that it's because it's difficult to fit the Rashtrakutas into a single bucket. Because like Kannada-speaking rulers who also use Sanskrit and who are based in Maharashtra, so they don't fit into our modern notions of nationalism. They don't fit into Marathi nationalism. They don't exactly fit into Kannada nationalism. They don't exactly fit into any other kind of nationalism. I think that one of the great tragedies of our contemporary history and politics is that we need these unitary, pure national heroes, right? And we need them to be heroes for, let's say, the Tamil people, the heroes for the Telugu people, and there cannot be individuals who kind of fulfill multiple roles or who exist outside those boundaries. But that's the tragedy of history, is that, of course, their political ideas, identities didn't gel with ours. These are completely different worlds. Their world was so different from ours. But by trying to fit them into these unitary frameworks, some people fall through the cracks. And I think that has really been the tragic fate of the Rashtrakutas. The question of repurposing is also a very interesting one. And there's actually an example of repurposing that did happen in the medieval Deccan, or really the early modern Deccan to be precise. So one site that emerged to prominence at this time is Bankapura. So Bankapura is actually founded as a city by one of the generals of Amoghavarsha Rashtrakuta, and then becomes a great kind of holy, sacred site. And in I think the late 16th, early 17th century, when Ali Adil Shah II of Bijapur conquers Bankapura, he finds a temple there, the Aravatthukambada temple, the 60-pillared temple, literally means a 60-pillared temple. And what he does is, he just makes these very slight modifications where he closes off the Garbhagriha, right? So he makes the main hall into like a closed hall, and he sets up a mihrab there. And now the Aravatthukambada temple is the Aravatthukambada mosque. So, and there's very little evidence of like iconoclasm or these very over-the-top narratives we have today of this complete destruction. Ali Adil Shah used Marathi and Kannada as courtly languages. So it's very clear that what he was trying to do was associate himself with a local holy site by, just like the Ottomans did, giving it a new identity. And that's very different from what the Delhi Sultans did in the Deccan, for example. And that's why I think, once again, it's very important to understand that the identities of history are not going to be the same as modern identities. Of course, the Deccan Sultans are not going to fit our stereotypes of these quote-unquote foreign invaders, because they didn't see themselves as foreign invaders. They saw themselves as, I can guarantee that, for example, the Qutub Shahis of Hyderabad, I'm from Hyderabad, they definitely spoke better Telugu than I did. So, I hope that answers your question.
They also stand
Yes.
beautiful.
I just want to say just an observation.
Sure.
But it's kind of interesting that, in a sense, what's happening in contemporary India, which is rediscovering sort of meta identities, more granular, more segmented identities, even amongst historians, is in a way making you go back and tell the stories of some of these forgotten things that don't fit, partly because historians today don't fit one narrative. And I think that's an amazing and an exciting time to be reading and learning from many of you, because there's so many young historians, Manu Pillai comes to mind, yourself of course, who are going and looking at history with a much more nuanced and, in some senses, neutral perspective. So the curiosity that drives you perhaps is not to create this one identity or this fitting into a particular slot, but rather the opposite, to kind of find how our own granular identities are constructed. So just very interesting.
That's a beautiful thought. Thank you so much.
I have a question, and then we'll pass the mic on there.
Sure.
Can you just, for the benefit of the audience, if you have a geographic, because if you see this movement from the Chalukyas and then into, multiple versions of the Chalukyas, from Aihole, Pattadakal, Badami, Kalyan, Vengi and all of that, and then Rashtrakutas, and then back up and down. In modern context, if I have to kind of, is there a way we can?
If I could just open up the browser on this, I could show you on a map. Is that okay? You don't have internet. Well, there is a nice visual in my book, so in case you needed more reasons to buy it. So I'm just typing.
To Hector Tulip, his drainage scheme, and Arthur Crawford's ideas that I kind of set off on this search. This was in early 2014. What else was there in Bombay's unbuilt past? Started searching, found a lot of content that really inspired. And by 2015, I said, this is like, I'll finish this book in 2 years.
North Karnataka, the Malaprabha River Valley, so Badami, Pattadakal, Aihole, if you want to see early Chalukya sites, you want to see later Chalukya sites, you'll have to, once again, so in the Bijapur area, and once again, you can see that the Bijapur Sultanate tries to link itself to the Chalukyas because they actually take Chalukya inscriptions, they put them on their city walls, over the gates and so on, and a lot of Chalukya temples around Bijapur still stand, and there are these, accounts of the Bijapur court saying that, the court went out and we saw these beautiful temples or like wonders of God. And the most amazing thing I've seen in the course of my research is a letter written by, of all people, Aurangzeb,
Yes.
who visited Ellora, and writes this letter saying that it is a marvel of the transcendent creator.
I was about to draw your attention to that itself. He spent a night there, and Maharashtra indeed talks about vernacularization that you mentioned, that you see in the Yadava dynasty.
Yes.
The rise of Marathi itself. You have Hemadri, for instance, doing the Chaturvarga Chintamani in Sanskrit, but you also have Chakradhar, who is from Gujarat, Baroch, encouraging Marathi in a way which has transformed the culture. And then the Chakradhar's adventures in Velur, as it is called, are also documented in the first Marathi text, which is the Leela Charitra. So all these excitements have somehow missed quote-unquote modern historians of India. And it is very exciting to see you bringing these things back into the focus. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Isn't Madhumati a female name?
Sorry?
The Arab?
Yes, Madhumati, that's the title he calls himself by.
Also?
Yes, sorry, you say it is a female? No. Yeah. He is definitely a man. You can tell from the context of the inscription and the terms used.
And the 11th century temple, which dynasty was that?
That wasn't built by the Chalukya court, but rather by a general of theirs. So it's called the Dodda Basappa temple. So it's in Hangal today. My bad. I've been watching too many Amir Khan movies lately. Yes. Yes, Dodda Basappa temple.
Factories of dust, Bombay streets, right? They were basically compacted mud. They were great factories.
Very fascinating, very interesting lecture.
Thank you, sir.
I have two questions, and they are interrelated. It's clear that there is a fairly intense interaction with lands very far away, and we also see that the structure of power is multi-ethnic, I mean, we know very interestingly that when the Zoroastrians first hit Sanjan, the local governor is a Tajik, Now, when do we see the beginning of a recognition of ethnic differences in this structure? I mean, when does this begin to change? Does the rise of colonialism have anything to do with this, or is it that there are more indigenous reasons why this begins to happen? That's the first thing. The second is, what is a greater source of revenue for most of these princes? Land revenue or customs from trade? Because this is very significant. When one gives way to another, it's a major transformation taking place.
So those are both fantastic questions. So to answer your first question, ethnic identity, I think that the earliest examples we have of what we might call ethnic, quote-unquote, ethnic strife actually date from the period of the Deccan Sultanate. So it's actually a very late development. It's an early modern development. So because the Deccan Sultanate actually bring in large numbers of Persian experts to staff their courts, and you also have locals who are part of the courts and have entrenched positions, there's a very clear sense that here are the Afakis, the Westerners, the outsiders who come, and we are the Dakhanis, the locals. But I don't think that the way that it is today, ethnicity was not necessarily divided on religious lines. It seems to have been more a question of, so they're going to come, they're going to work for the king, they're going to take all these land revenues from us, and then they're going to go back. They're not going to stay here, so they're outsiders. So the way that evolves, I think it really takes its most concrete form really in the British period, because Orientalists had this obsession, and I apologize to the ghosts of the great men surrounding us today, they had this obsession with thinking of India as this land of these tribes and castes, and of thinking of Indian society as a society which is primarily defined by those, where every occupational group does its own thing and nothing else. And that really, and of course, combined with the British's own political interpretations of India's past and the way they want to present it to divide electorates and so on, that's really what gives rise to our modern ideas of how ethnicity is divided. So I don't really see too much evidence of it in the early medieval period. They do, of course, there are mentions in Sanskrit Prashastis also of, Tamils who look like this and, Gujaratis who look like this. But once again, I don't think these were meant as ethnic divisions or more as cultural, understandings of cultural differences. The question about customs duty and land revenue, again, is interesting. There isn't really enough evidence to say because no tax registers have survived from the early medieval period. But I think the weight of evidence suggests that it was probably land revenue that was the major component. The reason why international trade was important was because, not because of the profits, because those also involved substantial amounts of risks. It was far easier for a medieval state to go out on a plundering expedition than to send traders abroad. But trade was important because it helped them get access to luxury goods, which were very important for maintaining their preeminence in political hierarchies. To show that I'm an emperor, you need to be able to present your court as being of sufficient grandeur. But I do think that begins to change, but much, much later once trade and also state capacity becomes much more impressive than what we have at this point of time. So, thank you, sir.
When he was in the city, you can see it's an open cremation ground, a little bit unregulated in different terms.
Yes, I'm not completely convinced because it is a much later text. I'm not sure if that was definitely his name, but I have come across this name. So, thank you, sir. Thank you all so much. Thank you.
Subscribe to Sarmaya and be a part of the stories and conversations around art, history, and culture.